Educator, a writer. And I know those are multiple titles, so I just wanted to kind of backtrack and tell you a little bit about Life After Loss. So I founded Life After Loss back in 2019 with just the YouTube channel, and it was truly to document my personal and professional experience with grief. So back in 2011, 11 years ago, approximately, I lost my mother suddenly. I was 20 years old at the time. And I really found that in my experience, as I was like literally thrown into this abyss of unknown and uncertainty, I really didn't know what I was walking into when she died. I didn't know what life was supposed to look like, feel like, or what in essence what my future was going to look like. So I also found myself feeling like I couldn't really talk about my grief. I couldn't really express my thoughts. I couldn't really express my emotions or anything that was coming up for me because when I tried to, oftentimes people either felt uncomfortable or would try to push me into feeling better, as in trying to redirect my attention and my energy into the good memories, into feeling better, into trying to preserve this sense of happiness and wholeness, which I did not feel. And all of this led me to really feeling disconnected in my own experience. I felt like, okay, there must be something wrong with me. Nobody really is able to listen to me. And they're constantly telling me how I should or shouldn't be feeling. And it took me quite some time to realize that no, there was actually nothing the matter with me, right? It was just the fact that I was brought up in a system, in a society that is not necessarily equipped to deal with difficult conversations like grief and like loss. And this is where life after loss came up for me as something more than just a career path, but it was something that was personal for me. This was what I wanted to give to the world because I believe that when we don't find what we are looking for, we can be that change, right? It's up to us to make that impact and to open up the doors for people that are behind us in line and perhaps struggling with similar experiences. So that's just a little bit about my story. And as we go along, I'll tell you a little bit about more what I do as far as being a grief educator, as well as a bereavement counselor. So today we're going to touch on our mission. We're going to also touch on what is grief, some of the common misconceptions, our perception and expectations of grief, and some of the benefits of grief education. So our mission here at Life After Loss is to focus on the process of the individual and help provide a safe space for people to experience and understand their grief without judgment or forced expectations set by society or loved ones. So as I mentioned, Life After Loss was founded and established back in October 2019 to help normalize the uncomfortable conversations related to death and grief. We are fighting to end the stigma of what society thinks grief should look like through education, exploration, and validation. The standard of a normal grief, and if you can call it that, if there was such a thing, follows an outdated, westernized ideology. And it doesn't usually take into account the many factors that can affect a person's grief experience, like the grieving person's culture, customs, religious, spiritual beliefs, the grieving person's age, their gender, the life history of the person who is grieving, including past experiences with loss, the grieving person's personality and coping style, the relationship between the grieving person and deceased, and the support available from friends and family. And the list simply goes on and on. So these are things that, again, usually are not taken into account when we look at grief from the perspective of what the Western culture has been able to provide us with. So what is grief? Before we start even talking about grief education, we first have to make sure that we understand what grief is, because believe it or not, I have spoken to countless people. I've spoken to family, to friends, to clients, to colleagues, and when I ask them what is grief, I get so many answers that are very nicely packaged. Like, for example, grief is when you cry, grief is when you feel bad about a loss, grief is when you lose someone, right? So it's very much like these very open kind of responses that I receive. And usually I see kind of like that confusion and that question in their face where it's like, I think this is what grief is, but I'm not too sure. So grief is the response to loss, and it's related to the loss of a loved one. It can be related to the loss of a pet, to a job, relationship, an object, identity, a belief system, transition periods, and anything else that has purpose or value in your life. And grief is as much of an emotional response as it is physical, as it is cognitive, behavioral, social, cultural, spiritual, and philosophical. A lot of times people have the misconception that grief just affects your emotions, and that is not the case at all. And let me tell you, when I first, at 20 years old, was immersed into this world, I thought the same thing. I thought, okay, grief is just when I start to feel bad and I start crying. No, grief is as much physical as it is emotional, cognitive, behavioral, and everything else. And that usually helps people also understand what they're experiencing a little bit more, because a lot of times when we feel that fatigue, when we get that grief brain or that fog, we're like, what's going on with me? Again, it's all that confusion of not knowing what to expect when we unfortunately lose a loved one. So some of the common misconceptions that people tend to have is that there is a timeline for grief. And as we know, there is absolutely no timeline, regardless of what people may try to convince you. Grief is a lifelong journey. There will never be a day that you will not miss or yearn for your loved one, right? So with that being said, like our grief, we learn to live with our grief. We don't simply leave it behind us or put it to the side or avoid it and hope that it doesn't come back or come up for us. No, there's no timeline. It's just simply something that we live with. If you don't outwardly express your grief, it means that you didn't care about the person. And I myself, along with so many people, have struggles with this misconception, because I remember even when I was at my mom's funeral and I was not crying because I already had cried for 3.5 hours, prior to her funeral. And also I just at that point showing an emotional display of how I was feeling was just not something that felt natural for me at that moment. So I remember receiving so many comments from people of like, you're so strong, or maybe, you're already starting to heal, or maybe you don't care as much. And all of this misconception just based on the fact that I wasn't crying. right? So we tend to invalidate people's experiences with comments like this, just based on what we think, is a standard for grieving, which leads me to my next misconception, which is there's a standard way to grieve. And grief is like your DNA. It is unique to you. You will experience it in your way. Crying is a sign that you haven't healed. Many times when I work with my clients, they will tell me at the beginning of our work that, I want to be able to stop crying because then it won't hurt so much. And crying is not a sense of weakness. Crying is not a sense that, you haven't healed or that something's wrong with you. It's a human reaction like all the other human reactions. The stages of grief are a linear roadmap of what you can expect in your grief experience. And this oftentimes has been misconstrued by so many people because Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was the one that came up with the 5 stages of grief, right? She created this for the people that were actively dying. She did not create this for people that were grieving the loss. Now, it can be applied to people that are grieving the loss of a loved one, but it wasn't meant to say, okay, today you're in stage 1, tomorrow you're in stage 2, and the next day you're in stage 3. No, it's more or less to give you an idea of what perhaps can come up for you, but it doesn't mean that it's a progression. You can, accept the loss today, and then all of a sudden the next day, feel like you're in denial about it. It doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. It's just how it is. Lastly, talking about your loved one and feelings will make you feel worse. This cannot be further from the truth. While yes, in the moment, the person may be visibly distraught while talking about their loved one, after they are actually done, you will see that usually there is that relief point. Not to say that, it's fixed, they're not in pain anymore, but to say that at least they were able to express it to another human being that wasn't trying to shame or judge them or tell them how to feel. So these are just a few of the common misconceptions. There are many, many more, but I think I would have to do probably a whole presentation on misconceptions if I wanted to list them all out. I wanted to give you guys an idea. Okay, so now we move on to our perception and expectations of grief. So the first point that I wanted to highlight was that what I have found in my experience working with grievers is that a lot of the times their perception and expectations of what grief should look and feel like has been inherited from what they've learned about grief through family, through friends, society, and anyone else that has a significant place or impact in their life. So let's say, for instance, they come from a background where death and grief weren't really openly discussed, or if they were considered to be taboo topics that we just don't speak about, then there is a higher likelihood that they themselves will experience a high level of discomfort when it comes to opening up about their own grief or even accepting their reactions as a normal part of the process. Also, people can be misled into thinking that the expression of grief is limited to just a handful of ways. So if the person has been previously told that in order to grieve, it means that they have to appear visibly distraught in front of others, then there will be a huge disconnect if the expression of emotion in public is something that they are just not comfortable with. So we start to see here how a lot of the ways that we try to navigate initially within our grief, it doesn't even coincide with who we are, with how we normally deal with situations, right? And then my next point is viewing grief through the lens of others, as I've mentioned, creates a disconnect between our actual experience and the experience we think we should be having, right? So this is also one of the major reasons as to why so many people struggle with feeling stuck at certain points in their grief experience, which can lead people to feeling depleted, feeling hopeless, that anything will ever change. They feel as though how they feel right now is how they will feel for the rest of their life. The next one is viewing grief as the enemy. And again, when we don't understand that grief is the normal reaction to loss, we tend to perceive it as the enemy. I know I did myself. When I initially felt all these overwhelming feelings, I was like, what is going on? I do not want to feel like this. I don't want to not have control over my emotions. I don't want to feel like I'm in constant battle between myself and these emotions. So we tend to see it as something that is chasing us to cause an immense amount of pain. Grief, while painful, is not there to harm us, though. It is the extension of the impacts that our loved ones had in our life, not just while they were alive, but also after they have died. Death caused loss, not grief. So if there's anything that we need to be mad about, is death, not our reaction to it. My next point is on death and grief have been taboo topics for years. And the more we refuse to talk about death and grief, the more unfamiliar and scary they will feel. We've reached a point in society where we want to focus on the good vibes, on the positive things of life, that we shut out the very important conversations about the difficulties we all experience in life. Some people even think that talking about these things will cause them to happen. Death and grief are not diseases, they are not contagious. You will not catch it by talking about it. Instead, you will open the doorway to life. Because when you talk about these kinds of things that are uncomfortable at first with your loved ones, then you can talk about anything else that may have been perceived as scary or uncomfortable for you. And then lastly, a grief experience that is not our own. We can spend a lot of time experiencing our grief the way others have told us to, which can lead us to feeling lost, disconnected, angry, hopeless, bitter, and paralyzed. We can only begin to heal through our loss when we finally silence the white noise that lives outside of us and begin to listen to ourselves, our grief. What does our grief need from us? That's a question that a lot of times we don't ask ourselves because we think that, okay, the answers lie with that outside of us. Someone else is going to tell me about my grief. Someone else is going to help me understand what it's like. No, it's all in you. It's all in your experience. So now we move on some of the benefits of grief education, which is what the focus of my work is. When we allow ourselves to actually understand grief and not just grief from the very vague perspective that usually we are taught, but grief in its most complex, rawest form, when we open ourselves to learning about it, we open up a doorway to ourselves to actually being able to see life in a very different perspective as well as our own experiences, right? So some of the benefits that we can actually get from grief education is that grief stops being a foreign concept. We stop looking at it as something that is so out there and unable to touch us until it does, right? Because now we understand that a lot of the experiences, emotions, and things that come up are normal, are part of the process. With grief education, we also allow ourselves the opportunity to honor our process, which can lead us to feeling more connected, right? A lot of the times I know I felt so disconnected. I felt like a complete alien in my experience just because I didn't understand. I didn't know what was what. I didn't know that what I was experiencing was grief. I didn't know that what I was experiencing was my right to experience because people kept telling me, no, you shouldn't be thinking like this, or no, you shouldn't be feeling like this, or no, just keep pushing or keep going, etc. We also understand the emotions and thoughts that arise in our experience. A lot of the times people ask me when I work with them, like, Lindsay, is this normal? Lindsay, is this something that should be happening to me? Right? So with grief education, we start to understand, okay, I'm sad today. That's okay. Let's sit with that sadness. Okay, today I feel frustrated. Today I feel, resentful or upset or angry or whatever emotions may come up with you. Today I feel nostalgic. But instead of asking them why they're there, we understand, okay, today I need space, right? Because these emotions are asking me or telling me that perhaps I've taken on a little too much, or perhaps, there's something happening around me that's triggering me to think about my loved one or feel a certain way. The stigma of grief also subsides with grief education, because then we stop, again, looking at it as something separate, looking at it as something that only a few people go through. With grief education, we are also empowered with knowledge to understand our needs and the kind of support we need. And we stop allowing others to dictate what our grief experience should look and feel like. This also provides us with insight and understanding into other areas of our life, because again, when we can actually silence all the white noise that lives outside of us and actually start listening to ourselves for something as complex and difficult as grief, you can only imagine how much more in tune we become to other things that happen that perhaps are not as difficult or are not as complicated. So in order to help bridge the gap between what grievers experience and the lack of support that they experience, I've developed online programs to help individuals that, like me, didn't know what grief was, didn't know that everything that was happening to me or everything that I was feeling was normal and it was part of the process. So, too often, society gets caught up in labeling and trying to place people in a box in order to make the grief process of individuals more digestible, more comfortable for others. We are sent paradoxical messages that make it difficult to figure out who we are supposed to be after loss. We're told we can cry about our loss, just don't cry too much. We're told we can talk about it, so as long as it's not too raw. We're told that we can take our time to heal, but make sure you're back to work and or school by Monday, right? So we are sent these messages that are contradictory, that are not really clear. They tell us to do one thing but expect something else. And it's no wonder why people struggle with finding who they are after loss. So it can be easy to forget about the weight that people carry on their shoulders because of this. And this is why, as I mentioned, I created my online programs where I work one-to-one with individual, and I also work with people in groups. And my goal is to help people silence out the white noise that lives outside of ourselves and experiences. So my programs, all of them are person-centered. They focus on meeting the individual where they are in their grief experience, right? Because when we try to push people beyond or try to tell them, how they should be thinking or how they should be feeling, again, we're not honoring that process at that moment. If sadness is what they are experiencing right now, we need to be able to get to the bottom of like, okay, let's feel this sadness. We've been running from it. We've been, trying to avoid it. How can we actually honor it, process it, and then be able to move forward, right? Not move on, move forward with it. So in my programs, we provide people with supportive bereavement counseling. We provide them with psychoeducation on grief-related topics, guidance in exploring their grief experience and different factors that may be affecting their experience. We review and process their own perception and expectations of grief and develop tailored coping strategies that allow them to navigate through their day-to-day experiences with hope that there is life after loss. Because again, at 20 years old, I did not know if there was any more life after my mom died, just because I was just like, this is it. Like, I don't see how life can get any better. And life can improve. Life will be different. Life will, there will be a lot of growing pains that go along with it, because in essence, you have to rediscover who you are after this significant event. But there is life after all of it. So if you have any questions or are wondering, more about my programs, feel free to scan this QR code, which will lead you directly to my website, where you can also take a look at everything else that I have worked on. I have a blog. I have a lot of videos on grief specific topics. Again, it's based on my personal experience, professional experience, and also research, because I'm all about educating myself so that when I present information to people, it is with actual concrete evidence. And you can contact me. You can actually follow me on Instagram at _life_after_loss. And if you want to drop me a message over email, you can also reach out to me at lindsay@lifeafterloss.co, and check out my website at www.lifeafterloss.co. So that is it for my presentation. Thank you guys so much. I hope that I have shed a little light on the benefits of grief education. I know I have a couple of people joining me, so I wanted to open up the space and see if anyone had any questions about anything that we covered today.
Hey guys, my name is Raiden over here. I see that you gave a lot of details on like common misconceptions and myths about grief. I was wondering, um how do you think these ideas were formed? Like, because I feel like it's like all around the world is like the same misconceptions that everybody um they think grief is one thing, but it's actually like another. Like, how do you think these are things that are formed? I don't know if that makes sense. Let me know if you want to
Yeah,
clarify.
no, and that's a great question. And I actually did research on this particular question, because I also was wondering, like, where are we coming up with this information? Like, where are all these stereotypes? Because they have to come from somewhere, right? And what I found was, like, back, thousands of years ago, like back when, like, the Greeks were starting to, let's say, like, have their own burial services, funeral service, etc. There was a lot of information that was based on how people would feel in the afterlife, based on what the living were presenting as their grief, as mourning, right? So, for instance, if someone died, it was like a ritual and tradition that people had to, like, at least their family had to outwardly express, like, heavy emotions of wailing, of just looking outwardly like distraught by this experience, right? Because they believed that if they didn't, in essence, wail or like cry or do all these things, that their loved one in the afterlife would not be happy, would not be pleased, and therefore not be able to make it up to, let's say, paradise, heaven, whatever they called it at the time. But that notion kind of continued to trickle down, from one generation to the next generation. And we started to absorb this, like, okay, we have to outwardly, express grief. If we're not doing it, then, our loved ones in wherever afterlife they are not going to be happy with us. And little by little, and it honestly starts with word of mouth can get very far, right, over the years. And yeah, it started as simply as that, just, not wanting to upset the loved one that had passed away.
Okay, so it's basically like a practice that was kind of, I would say it was kind of like a forced practice. Like, oh, I have to do this to I guess honor them.
Yes.
I guess that's the best way to put it, and it's not something that it's natural, because I feel like most people, the everybody has their own natural ways of grieving. Like, for example, one person may feel like they want to cry and they want to like reach out to people and like talk to them, and then there's other people, like, for example, like me, who is kind of more reserved and
Mm-hmm.
doesn't really feel the need to express outwardly their grief. So it's interesting to see that there's many different natural ways of grieving, and it's not just that like a forced like you said, like a typical way of grieving.
Absolutely, I agree. And again, I even was able to learn that people at this time, and even till present day, there are some cultures that's the practices is they pay people to actually go to funerals and like literally, like when I tell you rip their shirts and cry and wail, just outwardly it shows this like deep mourning, like people were that serious about not wanting to accept the deceased that they went to lengths of even like paying people to make sure that there was enough, pain that day. I hope I answered your question. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Yeah, definitely have a much better understanding now, of like the natural process of grief. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, the natural process is according to how you experience it, right? It's not how people think you should or you shouldn't, because again, a lot of times we try to like find information of like, is this normal? And then once you start researching, is this normal? Of course, you're gonna probably read all of these different articles written by different people that say yes, it is normal or no, it's not normal. And there's so many again different information that is enough to worry and stress anyone out and lead them to feeling paralyzed, like they're unable to really know how do I move forward with this. And that's another thing, a lot of times we think that we have to move on from grief, and we don't move on from grief. We don't move on from the loss. Is there any other questions before we end? These are really good questions. Thank you, Raylan. All right, well, if there's no more questions, I really appreciate everyone that joined me today. And again, feel free to check me out for any more information, or if you would like to contact me or have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram or on my website or via email. So thank you so much to everyone. Sending you all much love. And remember, there is no right or wrong way to grieve. There is only your way. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. All right, guys, thank you so much. Bye-bye.